Supreme Court nomination battles are, in sports lingo, Washington's version of a heavyweight championship fight. Today, to keep the metaphor going, we saw the undercard, a feisty middleweight battle, and a warm-up for the bigger one to come. Before we take the sports stuff too far, this isn't a game, and it matters to you. Gun rights, gay rights, terrorism policy, and the new health care law are just some of the big issues making their way through the federal courts. And those courts, from top to bottom, are being reshaped by a Democratic president whose views on the law are quite different, very different, than those of the Republican who had the White House for 8 years before him. Today, federal appeals court nominee Goodwin Liu was Washington's test case. Liu is a liberal law professor with a long and provocative paper trail. He says, for example, the Supreme Court decision that made George W. Bush president had no foundation in the law. And he opposed elevating Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court because Liu finds him too sympathetic to police and not sympathetic enough to racial minorities. That's just the beginning, and more than enough for an interesting confirmation hearing, even if the president wasn't on the verge of making a Supreme Court pick. But he is. And so as we go inside today's hearings, there are important lessons to be learned. A quick primer first on Goodwin Liu, 39 years old, Yale Law School, Rhodes Scholar, now a constitutional law professor at the University of California, Berkeley. The president wants to put him on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, based in San Francisco. The larger stakes were made clear today in a joke early on. Democratic Senator Ted Kaufman welcomed Liu to the committee and the Supreme Court nomination process. Republicans weren't making jokes, but did make clear, crystal clear, this is more about the president than any one nominee. Alabama's Jeff Sessions is the committee's lead Republican.
The president, out of all the fine lawyers and professors in the country and in the Ninth Circuit, has chosen Professor Liu. And I think it says something about his approach to the law, his philosophy of the law, and we'll be looking into that today.
So what did we learn about Goodwin Liu and more broadly about the bigger fight to reshape the nation's courts, including its highest? Here for tonight's Question Time, Neera Tanden. She vets people for judgeships and recommends possible nominees to the White House from her perch at one of Washington's leading liberal think tanks. Also here, Carrie Severino, a former law clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas, now chief counsel to the conservative Judicial Crisis Network. And if you tweet, you might already know she was at today's hearing. Thank you for coming. I want to go quickly to a little bit of the hearing. The challenge was the question of Bush v. Gore, but it was bigger than that because this nominee has a long paper trail, and often nominees with a long paper trail, once they get before the committee and before the cameras, get a little reluctant to discuss what they wrote some time ago. Let's listen to this exchange. He's being asked about why do you disagree with that big decision that made George W. Bush president?
Are you saying the court had no legal principle basis for the decision that it made in Bush versus Gore?
Well, Senator, I guess the only import of the phrase that I chose there was that it was my thinking that a legal principle should be something that applies in more than one case because it's a principle.
So you don't think they used a principle, but simply used some kind of pragmatic decision-making in the case?
Well, Senator, I guess I won't try to characterize it further here, but I've written what I've written and said what I've said.
I've written what I've written and I've said what I said. Neera, to you first. If you're a Democrat on that committee, or more importantly, somebody on the president's search team at the White House, as you consider a Supreme Court pick, how important is that, the paper trail? How many times do you want any nominee, whether it's for the Court of Appeals or for the Supreme Court, to be saying, I've written what I've written, I've said what I said, but I really don't want to talk about it anymore because I know it's politically controversial?
Well, I think Goodwin has a very long paper trail, and he's produced all his papers, and he defended his comments a great deal today. I mean, I think it was a kind of, one could argue, a little bit of a ferocious hearing. There was a lot of attacks, and as I recall, Senator Feinstein said, you know, you're amazingly keeping your cool. So I think there was a good give and take for the most part, and he was actually very good at holding forth and defending his views.
I was reading a lot of your tweets, and you have a very different opinion. You said your view was that he was backtracking all day long.
Absolutely. Goodwin Liu is an extreme nominee, even for the notoriously liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he knew that. That's why he spent all day running as fast as he could from everything he's ever said or written. He actually said, everything I've written in books and the articles that has no bearing on my role as a judge. what has he been doing all this time in Berkeley then?
Well, others have said what they have written in academic world would not affect them on the bench because they'd have to judge the cases. But I want to get to this. I want to get to some other points because I want to make this conversation not so much about him, but about the bigger issues facing the judiciary. But one of the things I found striking, to your point, is that at any time we have a high-stakes court nomination at this level, the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court, which we're about to go, there are two issues that always come up, sometimes raised by Democrats, sometimes raised by Republicans. And on these two, Mr. Liu had very little to say. One is God.
A federal judge has ruled that the National Day of Prayer is unconstitutional. Obviously, neither you nor I have read this decision, but can you think of any determinative constitutional argument that would support that ruling?
Senator, I'm going to confess that I have spent hardly any time in my career studying the religion clauses of the Constitution, and so I am not familiar with the relevant precedents in that area.
That was the nominee on God. Here he is on guns.
What's your view of the Second Amendment? Do you hesitate to say that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? Is that ambiguous?
Senator, I confess I have not thought about, written about the Second Amendment in any great detail.
I guess you could ask, is it plausible that somebody with the depth of his experience would not have more to say on those issues? But I think it's more a snapshot, and this is not just a Democratic administration. This short, I was going to call it amnesia, but that's not fair. The nominees don't want to say much about these particular issues. And again, it's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It has become the norm. Is that what we expect, Neera, just on the big controversial ones, just say, you know, I don't really know?
Well, I think what's happened in this process was demonstrated today. You know, you take one sentence, a few sentences from thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of writing and contort them and make them into something they don't necessarily mean. And you know, Goodwin is a person who has Ken Starr support, Clint Boggs support. You know, very conservative judges, and yet people are labeling him a conservative activist or labeling him extreme when he has a very, you know, he's a mainstream judicial philosophy. And so I think as we go forward, you'll see everyone's vetting right now a number of nominees, and everyone's looking at all the things they've said on the right and the left. And it's a little bit an unfortunate thing that one sentence someone writes can be taken out of context and used to, you know, destroy a nominee. And hopefully that won't happen in this process, and we'll have a good, fair debate as we go forward in the Supreme Court process.
We're going to continue the conversation in a minute, and I want to talk more broadly about the stakes here for the American people. But when you left that hearing today, what did you learn about the mood of the Republicans in terms of the people who you want to stand up to this president's nominees? Do you see them just poking and prodding at the hearings, or do you see them trying to block?
Oh, the battle lines were clearly drawn today, and I think Goodwin Liu's nomination is definitely in jeopardy. We already saw Don Johnson's nomination to the Office of Legal Counsel go down in flames, not even just because they're Republicans, but because moderate Democrats, especially in an election year, don't want to be seen voting for such an extreme candidate. So if the president chooses someone who's similarly extreme, and that's what his short list seems to look like so far, that's the kind of fight we're going to be seeing this summer.
Oh, I want you to hold on. We'll continue this conversation in just a minute. Let's resume our conversation with two people closely plugged into major judicial confirmation battles. Neera Tanden of the left-leaning Center for American Progress and Carrie Severino of the conservative-leaning Judicial Crisis Network. Let's help everybody at home understand. This is not just about Goodwin Liu or about the president's pick for the Supreme Court. This president right now has made 57 nominations to the federal bench so far, but there are 103 pending vacancies. He has in his power a chance to reshape the American judicial system. And I just want to give these numbers out. President Bush had 100 in his first 2 years. Over his 8 years in office, 328 judges confirmed to the federal bench. President Clinton, 127 in his first 2 years. Over 8 years, 379 judges confirmed to the federal bench. Let me start with you, Carrie. In the sense of, after 8 years of a Republican president, when you see this president who you disagree with philosophically, gun rights, gay rights, terrorism policy, the new health care law, we could go on and on and on. What are the stakes?
The stakes are huge because the Supreme Court is where all these issues are going to be decided. You've seen the president and the Democratic Congress pushing through an agenda of expanding government exponentially. We've got bailouts, buyouts, new health care laws. A lot of those issues are going to go before the Supreme Court, and who he nominates are going to be the people determining whether this gets by the Constitution or not.